As a biologist, this is always my favourite Humanists UK event of the year. And this year I'm particularly delighted because I did have a small hand in inviting somebody who I was very keen to hear from and who I thought you might be very keen to hear from as well. So our speaker for this evening is Professor Anjali Goswami. And Professor Goswami is a research leader in paleobiology and the Dean of Postgraduate Education at the Natural History Museum. She's also an honorary professor of paleobiology at University College London. And last year she was elected president of the Linnaean Society, the first person of colour to be elected in that position since the society originated in 1788. But hopefully... and hopefully that means that we are headed in the right direction. Professor Goswami's research is all about vertebrate evolution. So it would be a subject that I think Darwin would have really enjoyed. He would have loved to have been here amongst us tonight, finding out about this subject and finding out about all the new sciences that are now at play in uncovering that evolution. Professor Goswami, in particular, uses high-resolution 3D scans to classify and quantify and analyse how biodiversity changes through time, so how the forms of organisms change, and looking at how the environment is changing as well. She's looked at the evolution in detail of fish, of cats, of whales, and she's also looking at how we can really bring together what have seemed like quite disparate disciplines, particularly paleontology, which, as you know, is the study of fossils, and genetics as well. Her lab's incredible work on skull evolution in placental mammals, that includes us, graced the pages and the cover of Science last year in October. So I'm absolutely delighted that she's here tonight. I want to mention a couple of other things. She doesn't just work in a lab. She goes around the world looking for fossils from Svalbard in the north to Madagascar, and is currently leading expeditions in Argentina and India. And she is passionate about public engagement with science, something which is very close to my own heart, and also something which was close to Darwin as well. If we think about Darwin's insights and Darwin's revelations, and particularly his insight into the mechanism of evolution through natural selection, when he first published that in the papers of the Linnaean Society in 1858, nobody noticed. The biologist didn't bat an eyelid. In the summing up at the end of 1858, they said not much interesting has happened in biology this year. And the following year, his popular science book came out on the origin of species by natural selection. And then the biologists were forced to sit up and take notice. So it shows the power of public engagement. It's not just about taking science that we know is important out to people, but sometimes people can tell us which science is important. And Anjali has created and managed something called Phenome 10K, is that right? And that's a free online database including all of these wonderful 3D biological images that her lab has created, and it's free for use for research and education. So there's that lovely link there with public engagement. I'm going to stop speaking there and I'm going to hand over to Anjali. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that very lovely introduction. Just have the first slide up, and it's a great honor to be here with all of you today, especially to be here in person with in such a lovely setting with so many people. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the research we've been doing in my lab, and really what insights I've gleaned from what's about 25 years of study of the evolution of the natural world. And I'm also going to tell you a bit about my background and how I kind of came to this field, and what are some of the key moments in my life that I think have shaped me into becoming the kind of person that I am today. So as a paleontologist, I'm very lucky, as Alice mentioned, to be able to go out into the world and go to places like this. This is my field site in Argentina. And the area on the left is covered with Cretaceous rocks, full of dinosaurs. We pulled dinosaur skulls out of that. And all the area on the right is after the mass extinction. And those kinds of experiences, journeying through the history of life on Earth, gives you a really interesting perspective on life in the modern day. And so those are some of the things I want to convey to you today during the course of this talk. So most times when people find out that I'm a vertebrate paleontologist, they assume that this was what I was like as a young child, obsessed with dinosaurs. The truth is, I didn't actually know that this was a field until I was in university. So it definitely wasn't experiences of enjoying dinosaurs as a young child. It absolutely was not this at all. I actually only saw this movie for the first time during the second lockdown, I think, and only because my kids wanted to. Now, my story is actually a bit more convoluted, and for important reasons, I think. So I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, in the United States, as you can probably tell from my accent, which has not gone away in the 17 years since I've moved to this country. And growing up in Detroit was an interesting experience. If I'm honest, the main things I remember from my early years there was going to closing down sales at various department stores. But actually the most important thing that happened, and I would actually argue this is the most important thing that has ever happened in my life. Sorry to my husband, but I think this is a very key moment in my life. Happened not in Detroit, but during the year that we did not live in Detroit because my parents' green cards were denied when I was about 4 years old. And this is something that happened, but they'd already been there for 6 or 7 years at that point. They had a house, a car, a business. They were offered the opportunity to move to a small town in North Dakota, which they politely declined and said they'll take their chances. So we went back to India. Well, it was the first time for me, actually. Those are my parents up there, not actually in 1980 when this happened. And during what ended up being about a year in India was when the most important experiences of my life happened. So where my family is from in India is Madhya Pradesh, the central province. You can see in green there. And this is a place where half of the world's population of tigers lives. It was, of course, the setting for Kipling's The Jungle Book. And it very much was the first memory that I can really draw on is very much like this, sitting on an elephant back in the jungle, not far from where my family lives, and seeing a tiger for the first time, so a scene like this. And I remember being awestruck by the beauty of this creature, terrified because I could, at that age, recognize that it looked at me like I was food. And I was sitting next to my younger cousin who started crying right away. Now, I don't remember where my parents were at this time, but I assume that they were sitting next to me, holding me in a death grip. Because although these are not the tigers that we saw that day, these are tigers that we saw more recently when we went back to those same parts with my children. And my husband took this photo while I had both of my kids in a death grip, so they didn't fall off of the elephant and become food for these things. So this was, to me, one of the most important things that ever happened. It is a memory that is always stuck in my mind, and it's something that has really cemented my fascination with the natural world, which is really, I think, the defining thing of my life. Now, the other thing that actually happened during that year was that my mom's younger brother died. And again, I was 4. I don't remember really anything about it other than the funeral, which was a traditional Hindu cremation, outdoors. It was in the evening. I remember this huge fire that was engulfing my uncle's body while my family was obviously in mourning. It was loud. It was intense. It was full of a lot of emotion. And the things I took from that, which, again, I was 4 years old, but I definitely remember the scene sitting on a hill with one of my other uncles while watching this whole scene play out, was that, life is extremely unpredictable, precious, and this is what you have, right? And that was something that I think not the other people in that scene, or in that moment, took from that specific incident, but I certainly think that is another thing that always stuck with me. Okay, so we were in India for about a year. Before my parents finally got their green cards approved, we moved back to Detroit, and the next really important incident of my life happened. And that happened at this place here, which is the Catholic school that I went to for a couple of years when I was growing up. And I was raised Hindu, and so I was the only Hindu at this Catholic school, and that's super common in the south side of Detroit. And so that meant that every Wednesday and Friday during Lent, this was me, the only kid sitting in the pew, while everybody else went up and did the things that they do. I've never quite figured it out, to be honest. And this happened, week after week for multiple years. And I asked one of my friends, what are you getting up there? And so the next time she went up, she palmed her Eucharist for me, brought it back, and gave it to me, and I tried it. Disappointing, obviously. Definitely not something I would queue up for. But more importantly is that somebody saw us. And I want to emphasize that I was a really good kid until this point. Didn't last. But until this point, I was straight A student, always getting moved up for extra honors courses, never got in trouble. But that day, I got detention for the first time in my life. Literally for eating the body of Christ. And so that was one of the other really important things that happened to me growing up, was the message for me was clear: stick with tigers, there lies safety and reasonableness. And so tigers have continued throughout my life to really be a big part of it. After college, I spent years working in their conservation, and really since then, I've spent a lot of time thinking about their evolution. And so they've really been a passion of mine, and their evolution and that of their wider clade or their wider family has been something that I've really always felt extremely interested in, extremely passionate about. And I want to slightly digress for a second and talk about the use of that term when we talk about our science, because I think it's something that people often misunderstand about scientists, right? They think that we have to be kind of cold and objective, yes. And this is a line from the intro to The Origin of Species, where Darwin says that he conducted a most deliberate study and dispassionate judgment, which led him to be convinced that species are not immutable. And I think that word, dispassionate, is the one that people misinterpret a lot, to think of science and people who base their actions on science or scientific information as being kind of cold. From my opinion, it is anything but. So Darwin puts this into one of his letters, where he says, a scientific man ought to have no wishes, no affections, a mere heart of stone. But he says a lot at the beginning because he recognizes that he's not like this. And in fact, Darwin, and I would argue every good scientist, is not like this at all. Every good scientist is driven by their passions for their study subject, driven by their passions to explore things that nobody else knows about, right? We live at the edge of human knowledge, and we choose to be there. And sometimes we choose to jump off. And I think that this is really encapsulated in the different writings of Darwin that catches different moods. So sometimes he's talking about how scientists should have a heart of stone, and how he's using dispassionate judgment. Other times he's talking about how he's dying by inches from not having anybody to talk about insects with. This is a man who did not lack for passion, and if I'm honest, he's probably a little heavy on the emotional side for my taste. But these are, I think, important things to reflect on when people think about evolution and how we interpret it and how we apply it to our lives, because somebody who was lacking in passion couldn't have written these words. These are obviously the most heavily cited words of The Origin of Species. If you have read anything of Darwin's, you have read these lines. I've read them a million times, but I never get sick of them. And I'll be honest, I never fail to feel quite emotional when I read them, because they are beautiful. So I'll just read it for the few of you who maybe haven't. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. Now that is an absolutely fantastic statement, and it really captures something that, to me, is still really striking when I think about the world and when I think about the evolution of life on this planet, which is the focus of my work. Because thinking about just this room right here, right? All these people, and along with us in this room, there are trillions of other organisms literally living on you and in you, maybe more or less depending on, your bathing schedule and things like that, but trillions regardless of your own personal hygiene. And with all of these trillions of organisms in this room, with each and every one of us, we all share something, which is an unbroken chain of descent that goes back billions of years, right? Every single thing that's alive in this room has an ancestor 100 million years ago, 1 billion years ago, 2 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago. We're all part of that same chain of descent. And that's absolutely magnificent to ponder. And Darwin really captured that, I think, with this phrase. And it's certainly something that has really been the root of what my research program is trying to understand, is understanding that story of how life on Earth has evolved. And so my research program is, if I were to define it scientifically, is to understand what are the intrinsic and extrinsic factors that influence tempo and mode of evolution of organismal form. The simple way of saying that is, why do animals look the way that they do? And that's basically what I'm interested in. And if you think about things on a really large scale, which is how I think about things, large scale in terms of space, large scale in terms of time, large scale in terms of the tree of life, one of the most interesting things is that diversity in form is really not evenly distributed across any of these different parameters. So if you look across space, if you look across the world today, there's far more species in the tropics than there are in the poles, right? So that's what we see in red here. If we look through time, we know that there's periods in the past that have really high standing diversity, punctuated by really rapid decreases, which we often identify as mass extinctions, as well as really rapid increases, often in response to some change in environment or some change in the biota, such as in response to mass extinctions. And when we look across the tree of life, we know that some groups of organisms are hugely diverse, right? There's 1 million named species of insects, for example, whereas other species, there's only a few species, and as far as we can tell, a lot of these clades have always been species poor. So why do you get this? Why do you get this diversity across organisms? And this has really been the central question that's driven me over the last few decades. And really, because diversity is the question I'm really interested in, it's actually quite funny that I'm also obsessed with cat evolution, because cats are the worst animals to study if you're interested in diversity. They are the outlier in almost any way you can think of when it comes to organismal evolution. And that's mainly because, quite frankly, they all look the same. There's 10 million years of evolution captured on this slide, and if you take their fur off, which is kind of how I look at animals, sorry, they all look identical. They're small, they're big, but if you scale them up, they pretty much look exactly the same. In fact, it was thinking about this problem about 2 years ago now, about a year and a half, that got me into a little bit of trouble because I was just pondering cat evolution, as I am prone to doing at random times, and I suggested, wow, the fact that they just do this one thing, up, down, big, small, but nothing else about them changes, maybe they've just nailed it. Maybe they're just living at an adaptive peak, and all the other groups of organisms that are constantly flitting around, changing what they're doing, trying out different kinds of ecologies, maybe they're just the ones that aren't very good at anything. I put it on Twitter, and I don't know if you guys know this, but people on Twitter have strong opinions. And they tend to feel free to shout them back at you. So I made a lot of people angry. I made the crab people angry. I made the shark people angry. I made the monitor lizard people angry. I made all of them fairly angry. But actually, I'm right. I really, I didn't think anything about this original tweet, but then once I started getting all the responses back, I really dug down, and I think that I am right in this on cats. And I know this because I've actually spent a lot of time over the years working on cat evolution, right? So again, cats really just vary in body size. The biggest cats are about 300 times bigger than the smallest cats. That's a huge, huge range of body size for any one family of animals. And yet, you can see from these examples here that they do the same things. If you're a tiny kitten, like this guy over here, or a big lioness, you can do the same moves. If you're a tiger or a house cat or a cougar, you can do the same stuff. And again, here, you can see the posture. And in fact, all of these pictures are showing that cats break a fundamental law, or rule at least, that no other four-legged animals do. No other four-legged animals get above about 50 kilograms of weight and can do this kind of crouching and very flexible movement that cats do. Cats are the only ones that manage to do that. I think through sheer stubbornness, I have to assume, because they're cats, but it was a mystery. And so we actually got funding to try and figure out, how do they manage to do this? How does a 500 kilogram, or at least a 300 to 400 kilogram cat manage to be so springy like a little house cat? And how do they manage to be so kind of constrained in how they evolve? Why can't they do anything other than as kind of one skull morphology or one morphology? And it actually turns out the answer is in their development. And so Alice mentioned that I like to really mix different kinds of data together. And one thing I really like to pull data from is embryology and development of organisms. And I'll talk more about why that's so fundamental to really appreciating why life on Earth looks the way it does. And cats are a good example of this, actually. Almost nothing else, but this at least. Because if you look at a cat, this is a baby cat and this is an adult cat. This is a baby dog and this is an adult dog. And cats grow their skulls in a way that we describe as isometry. They just scale up in size with whatever falls along the same line as overall body size. Dogs, on the other hand, get longer in their faces as they get bigger. And in fact, most organisms do get change in shape as they get bigger in size through development. And the fact that cats don't have this shape change through development the way that other organisms do is why really adult cats look like baby cats and why big wild cats look like small wild cats. And in fact, it's why when you try to breed cats, you can't really do much more to humiliate them than take their fur off. Whereas with dogs, there's infinite ways you can come up with a really messed up dog because they have this incredible allometry, this change in shape associated with their body size. And so you can move along this line, and breeders will select along this kind of line of growth, whether you want a really short-faced dog, a really long-faced dog. Cats, you just can't do anything with them. And so cats are really illuminating in that way in terms of development. There's another way in which cats are really illuminating, and actually Darwin is the one who found this and was obsessed with it, in particular in going to cat shows and finding out about people's white cats with blue eyes or with different colored eyes, because they're almost always deaf. And he understood that this was because these traits were linked somehow. Obviously, he didn't know about genetics and things like this at the time, but he understood that there were linkages between traits, and those linkages affect how they can evolve. Now, I study this now in terms of looking at how phenotype, which is the anatomical characteristics of different organisms, how that is a reflection of their development and also their genotype. So how linkages among traits and on genes or through different kinds of developmental actions actually mean that those traits are functionally linked in adults. And so when the one varies, the other one has to vary or is negatively impacted. Now that's actually really important for understanding evolution, because not everything that we can think of exists, right? When we look at life on Earth, we see there's lots of things that we can imagine, dragons, et cetera, that never have actually evolved. And on the other hand, there are lots of things that seem to evolve over and over and over again in different groups. Now, people take this repeated evolution of different morphologies or different kinds of animals, as evidence of some sort of predeterministic force. Some people take it as evidence of a higher power guiding evolution. It's actually just development and genetics. Because if you have these correlated correlations among traits, when they evolve, they can only evolve in a certain number of directions. So here's a couple of figures to explain this. First of all, this is a study that somebody did several years ago looking at mollusks, at snail shells, and looking at the very initial ways that they coil, what kinds of morphologies can then evolve, and showing that just in the very basic nature of how the earliest parts of their development happen, they can only go down a couple of paths. So what this is showing is all these areas here that are in gray are empty morphospace, so empty regions of possible morphologies that will never evolve because of how organisms develop currently. This is my own little simulation here, where the red dots here, this is based on carnivore skulls, because again, I like cats. So the red dots here are if you just let things evolve with all the traits being independent from each other, so no genetic linkages, no developmental linkages, every trait can just modify as it needs to, then you get this huge distribution of shapes. But actually, if you just add observed correlations among traits, we get this really, really limited area of morphospace or possible shapes being explored. And so this is the key point here, that these trait linkages, the genetic and developmental architecture of organisms makes things like convergence not just, more likely, but actually extremely likely, probably expected, in fact. And so that's just one key point that I think is important to bring home, because when we think about diversity and when we think about examples like, so this is this model that we came up with to explain this. We called it the fly in the tube model of evolution, of integrated phenotypes, which is these correlated phenotypes. Essentially, it's a trap. Once you have a developmental pattern laid down, and this is laid down really quickly in the evolution of different groups of organisms, then there's a limited area that this fly can kind of fly around in and explore. But all of this coming together shows us that even when we see examples like this, so this is a marsupial wolf over here, this is a placental wolf, two different clades of mammals that are separated by, say, 160 million years of evolution. So if you don't know anything about development, you might look at these two things and think, well, there's no way that could happen without some guidance, right? But actually, they're both mammals. They both largely share their developmental patterning. Those traits share a lot of developmental similarities in terms of how they're correlated, and I know this because I've measured it. And so given similar ecological pressures, and they have very similar ecologies, you would actually almost kind of expect that they would evolve very similar morphologies. So when we think about life on Earth, and we think about why life on Earth looks the way it does, and why it doesn't look the way it doesn't, if you can follow that logic, then development is critical to that understanding. Okay, so all of this is really underlaying what the work that I have done over many years is, why does life look the way that it does, both today and in the past? And I really want to emphasize this past bit, because of course if we think about life on Earth today, it isn't a clear reflection of what happened in the past. It's not even a very good reflection of 10,000 years ago, let alone 100 million years ago. And if we want to understand the evolution of life, we need to take into account all the things that have existed in the past. Because if our models and if our understanding only explains life on Earth today, but can't explain how you get these massive ground sloths or these really crazy ancient sharks, let alone all the other stuff, then we're going to be wrong. Okay, so over many years now, my lab has really been focusing on trying to gather the kinds of data that we can use to reconstruct why life has evolved the way that it has, what are the primary factors that are shaping the way that life has evolved, and hopefully using that to predict into the future how life will change, going through future climate change and future environmental changes. And to do this, we've used a lot of really nice imaging equipment and traveled around to dozens of museum collections across the world to gather a data set that now comprises a couple thousand species of living and extinct, mainly vertebrates is what we've been focusing on of late. And here's just an example of some of the diversity of skulls that we have in that data set. So you can see, hopefully, that this is a really extraordinary range of skull shapes. So here we have some crazy amphibians. Here's actually a river dolphin, a Ganges river dolphin. We have obviously some dinosaurs and early mammal relatives. It's a huge, huge variety of shapes of skulls. And what I wanted to do is understand, how does this variety evolve? Now we focus on the skull in particular because it houses all the sensory organs, or most of them at least. It is obviously critical for feeding and for the brain, and it's also used in a lot of ways for interactions with other organisms. And so it carries a lot of information about ecology in it. And so in order to capture that diversity of shapes, we came up with this method, which is kind of a semi-automated method. It's a little bit more manual than I would like, to be honest, but essentially it uses some code in a programming language called R. Oh, we lost that. Is that coming back? Well, I'll tell you about it in the meantime. And what this code actually does is basically it takes each of our skulls and it projects the same points onto the skull. You can see some movement in the back. And so when we do that, when we get this diversity of skull shapes across all of our thousands of species, then we can start to make some really interesting comparisons. And we're doing that using the same kinds of data, which means that we know which means that we then can say for sure that this is more important in this group, this is more important in this group, and these are things that are actually different across all of our groups or the same across all of our groups. And it's not just a factor of having different kinds of data. Yeah, okay, I think they're working on it. And so with that kind of approach, we were able to generate this really lovely data set that spans across all of our species. And our species in this data set capture some, oh, perfect, okay, great. Let's go to the next one. Oh, oops. So this is our data set. This is a representation of our data set. So you can see we have really nice coverage of all these different skull shapes. And these different species here, so we've got some mammals down here, we've got some amphibians up here, birds and dinosaurs and crocs, and lizards over here. And combined, these species represent about 340 million years of evolutionary history. And we have lots of fossils in this data set that are directly sampling moments in that past. And we can combine that data that we've gathered with our understanding of how they're related. So over here, we have this evolutionary tree in the background that shows the different groups. So these are the mammals again, et cetera. And you can see the root of this tree is back in the Carboniferous, say 340 million years or so ago. And we can use that tree then to reconstruct the changes that have happened earlier in time. So we can do things. Alice mentioned this paper that we had that came out a few months ago in Science. And so the first thing that we tend to do is just plot them into what we call a morphospace. Again, just capturing the main variations in the data set. And this is our mammal data set. Over here you see whales. Whales are weird. It's not a big surprise. Kind of off in space, although actually a lot of other groups try to be kind of whale-like. There's a lot of things that kind of push their nasals up on top of their head, to have a big trunk or something like that. Rodents actually are pretty weird in a way that I've never appreciated, because I usually really make fun of rodents in general. I mean, they're half of mammals, and they kind of all look the same, but clearly not as much the same as cats. I don't know why the same logic doesn't apply to cats for me. But rodents have their own area of morphospace up here, but really every other kind of mammal kind of sits in this yellow hot spot in the center of the morphospace. And these colors here really just show how many different species are found in those areas. And so, across the entire breadth of the mammal family tree, you find mammals that kind of look the same. And actually, the most average mammal, if you're interested in, is actually a fox. So a lot of things kind of look kind of foxy. So we can take all of this and we can not just look at variation, but we can try and figure out, okay, then what are the factors that affect how these shapes are evolving or how fast they're evolving? And here are some of the factors that came out as being really significant for determining how fast species evolve. So there's lots of different things that we can look at when we look at shape evolution or the evolution of form. We can look at how much variation there is, which is what the previous plot was about. But we can also, and one thing I really like looking at is how fast it has evolved, because changes in the rate of evolution through time are indicators of some of the factors that cause that change in tempo. So really big upticks can suggest an opening of new ecological niche space or a mass extinction or something like that, or a response to a mass extinction if you survived. Obviously, if you don't survive, you don't tend to evolve quickly afterwards. We'll come back to that point. But in terms of mammals, some of the things that do evolve quickly happen to be things like precocial mammals, so things where the young are actually really functional at birth, unlike any of the young that any of us have. Social mammals tend to evolve really quickly, and I did all this work during the pandemic, so that's one of those results that just felt like a cruel joke. To sit in your bedroom, in the dark, finding, social things help you survive, great. And things that don't have a fixed activity pattern and kind of modify when they are active during the day, they tend to evolve quite quickly. So these are things that we can then, going forward, build into models of how different species might respond to changes in their environment and see which species might be less able to evolve quickly or to change their behaviors, et cetera, to survive rapid change. Now we can also pull in the data that we have from their relationships and try and look at where on the tree do we see fast relationships. Again, this is an evolutionary tree, So these branches here, the ends represent all of the species in our data set, and all the internal branches represent kind of ancestral nodes. So this goes back to, say, about 75 million years or so ago, because we're looking at placental mammals in this case, which is the group that we're part of course. And the red branches are the ones that are really fast evolving. The blue branches are the ones that are pretty slow, as are the green ones, and the orange and yellows are kind of in between. And so hopefully you can see that the red ones are really concentrated in the whales, but also at the base of a lot of the different groups. So they're really early ancestral branches of some of the major groups of mammals, show really fast evolution. Now we can take that and we can flip it and look at it through time by taking all these branches and binning when they actually existed, when they actually occurred, and looking at how those rates change through time. And what I wanted to do in particular was to use that kind of approach to ask the question of how did mammals respond to the end Cretaceous mass extinction. So, for 100 years, people have been suggesting that the mammal radiation is really a response to dinosaurs going extinct and a lot of new opportunities, and that mammals have really been exploding ever since. Of course, we live in the age of mammals that suggests this is true. Paleontological data really supports this in general, but there's actually been a huge amount of debate from different sources of data, like DNA data, on this question. And so what I'm going to show you now is actually a rate plot through time. And so, and this is experimental, so you're kind of guinea pigs for us trying to show people how to interpret these plots. And so we tried to put it to music. This is the idea of one of my former postdocs, Aki Watanabe, who's now in New York. And so what you're going to hear is the rhythm of mammal evolution over the last 70 million years or so. High notes tend to show fast rates of evolution, lower notes show slower rates of evolution. And you can see the meteor there indicates when the dinosaur extinction actually happened. It's a really fast evolution right there, right after the meteor hits. And you can see then declines. Then you get another uptick when things like whales evolve and bats evolve during that really peaky area in the middle of the Eocene, which is also the warmest period in the last 65 million years. And then we have actually this general decline in rates through the Cenozoic. And this was actually really surprising for a few reasons. One, the idea that things just explode and then decline is kind of normal. It's called an early burst pattern. It's a classic adaptive radiation. But we don't have a classic adaptive radiation here because we have these later peaks. And I think these peaks are generally aligned with large-scale climate events. And so we coined a new phrase for this called the attenuated model of evolution, where you get this declining wave signal with rates of evolution slowing down through time as you move away from a really extreme event like a mass extinction. And so I think this kind of captures an interesting pattern that I expect we'll find in other groups once we start looking for it. Of course, we have some other groups. So we can look at, for example, birds. And so you will probably know that birds obviously go back to the Jurassic, but actually extant birds are really a post-Cretaceous radiation. And so we do see this burst, again, right after the meteor. Another kind of peak in this warm, happy Middle Eocene is actually called the early Mid-Eocene climatic optimum. And then we get this decline, a little bit of a bump here where there's another nice warm period. But again, a kind of decline through time with just a couple of waves of higher rates. Now, of course, not everything ends up being like a bird or a mammal. There are things like your crocs, which are just your classic, slow, steady, they've been doing their thing for a couple 100 million years. They'll probably still be doing it for a couple 100 million years. Well, we'll come back to that point too. But really, in the Jurassic, there's lots of innovation in terms of marine crocs, but they're kind of just doing their thing. The Cretaceous was actually a pretty fun time to be a crocodile. They evolved all these interesting terrestrial forms that got a little bit crazy, kind of small, herbivorous, running around on two legs, but none of them make it through the KPG mass extinction, actually. Then in the Cenozoic, crocs mix it up a little bit, but they're mainly slow and steady throughout, until actually quite recently, where, especially in that kind of like Indo-Pacific region, there's actually an uptick in rates of crocodile evolution, which is interesting. And so we might be living in the heyday for crocodiles. We'll see. And then, of course, there is a group that the end Cretaceous mass extinction wasn't so super for. I'm sure you've heard of them. They're called dinosaurs. And they really, the Jurassic was a great time for it to be a dinosaur. This is when things like Dippy, if any of you have seen Dippy at the NHM, was around. The Cretaceous, again, was a time period with lots of innovation going on. There was, this is when you see things like T-Rex and Triceratops, some of those really classic things showing up in the late Cretaceous. But you also get lots of things innovating in terms, that's a question that a lot of people have looked at. But I think the weight of current evidence is that, dinosaurs are still really innovating throughout this period. And obviously dinosaurs are still around today in the form of birds, but I think there's a big difference between most of the dinosaurs and the dinosaurs that are around today. And of course, there's other things that are around too. So this last little bit is actually just putting all of these different groups together. It was quite tricky to get all of the things lined up, so it might not quite work perfectly. But we have our dinosaurs, we have our mammals, we have our birds, we have our crocodiles, but we of course also have things like the lizards, the snakes, we have the salamanders and the frogs, and so we can try and put them all together. Now, putting all these different sounds together is actually, and making it sound anything other than awful was really tricky. And hopefully one day I envision a beautiful orchestra with different instruments that actually sound good together. But for the electronic version, this is what we could manage to pull off. I couldn't remember what instrument we have for the turtles, sorry. There's snakes coming in the Cretaceous. And then pretty soon we're gonna get to the end of the Cretaceous and see our birds and our mammals really start to kick into high gear. And you can see that a lot of the groups, not all of them, but a lot did have a bit of a response to that mass extinction. Some had a negative one and some had a positive one. Okay, so hopefully you can see the salamanders, turtles. These are groups that are really for many of these groups. But of course, that's how the dinosaurs felt, right? And we know, hopefully, everybody knows that we are, of course, in the middle of or really at the beginnings of what very well could be described as the next mass extinction, the sixth mass extinction. I'm just going to ask how many people have heard of the biodiversity crisis? I'm sorry, actually, no, I'm going to say, how many people have not heard of the biodiversity crisis? Okay, good, nobody. How many people do not think it's caused by human activity? Yeah, on the fence? Find me later. So if we look across the world today, right, and we know that there are tons of assessments going on constantly. We know that there's parts of the world that we don't have enough data for. We know there's certain groups of organisms that we don't have enough data for. But for all the areas that we do have enough data, we can clearly see there's a huge amount of decline in terms of species diversity, species populations. So these plots here are showing decline in the abundance of species across the world. So North America, here's Europe up here, Latin America and the Caribbean, huge declines, Africa, huge declines. And so these numbers should shock you, right? Because the numbers that we have where we cut off what is a mass extinction, and when we look in the deep past, is 50%, right? And that's happened 5 times, according to our estimates, 5 times over the last 500 million years, give or take. So it doesn't happen a lot. And the other thing that the paleontological record shows us is that recovery does not happen quickly. So I know I was showing you these plots where these groups are really radiating quickly in the wake of these mass extinctions. And yes, there is a rapid response by the groups that survive. But also, there's 2 points I want to make about that. One is that just because they survived didn't mean they didn't take a huge hit. So mammals, the group that I mainly focus on in my research, is a group that barely made it through the KPG mass extinction. I've actually spent a fair amount of time trying to count all of the lineages, so that's the specific kinds of mammals that make it through that mass extinction. And you're talking about maybe as few as a dozen different groups that make it through, different species that could have made it through, and then radiated in the wake of, in the empty ecospace that was left over. There are huge numbers of mammals that are around in the late Cretaceous that did not survive that mass extinction. The majority of mammals that were around at the end of the Cretaceous did not survive that mass extinction. So it was a squeaker. Okay, we barely made it through, and yes, we did manage to make it this far. And obviously, if there wasn't a mass extinction, we would not be here today because dinosaurs would be having this lecture. It's just a fact, really. But you know, mass extinctions are horrific for really everything that's on the planet. So just because a group survives doesn't mean that they're magical or, you know, have any really special traits. There might be things that give you slightly better chance of surviving, being small, being warm-blooded. Things like this might be helpful, being, you know, a little bit more flexible in your diet. But it still means a whole bunch of things that were all of those things went extinct. Okay, so one thing about the mammals surviving is that most of them didn't. The other really important thing to take home is that even though they radiated really quickly in the wake of that, you know, within 100,000 to 1 million years, we start to see larger mammals around. That's a long time. I'm talking about 100,000 to 1 million years before we start to see some of those niches getting filled up again. By some estimates, it took between 4 to 8 million years for species diversity to recover to the levels that it was before the KPG, or the end Cretaceous mass extinction. That's the fastest recovery that we know about in the fossil record. When we look at the other 4 mass extinctions, they took much, much longer. You know, tens to hundreds of millions of years potentially. And so these events that take, you know, in the case of the KPG, or the end Cretaceous mass extinction, they happen in a minute. They take millions of years to recover. What we're doing now will also take millions of years to recover if we don't act now to stop it from happening, right? And this isn't a meteor. This is a choice that every one of us makes every single day to not do anything about this, right? So let me ask one more question. How many of you feel that you are doing everything that you can possibly do to stop the biodiversity crisis? Nobody? Okay, I was hoping somebody could tell me what I could do, because I absolutely don't think I'm doing even remotely close to enough. You know, we try to do a few things, but we could all be doing a ton more. And when you look at the deep past, when you look at, you know, those first few days, when we do reconstructions of what those first few days after a mass extinction are like, or how about the first million years, the first 2 or 5 million years after a mass extinction, these are not great times to be alive. There's this effect that I think is a really clever one called the dead man walking effect that shows that in the period after mass extinction, everything also has higher extinction as a result of the ecological collapse that ensues, right? And so that's what happens. It's not a quick thing that happens and then you just recover. It's a thing that has lingering effects for a long time. So why would you ever choose to go through that when you could make a decision to stop it from happening, right? And so that's the thing, thinking about, you know, life, you know, over the course of a lifetime and life over the course of the planet's lifetime, is that, you know, I started off talking about how life is unpredictable. And then I gave you a whole bunch of data that showed how we could predict certain aspects of it. And so we do. So I talked about how we want to use some of those results to try and predict how different species might respond to changes in their climate. But in fact, the truth is, when you go through a mass extinction, it really becomes a lottery after a certain level. Those rules that I'm talking about, those apply to normal times. We are not going into normal times. We're going into really extraordinary times. And I think it's something that is really underappreciated by people who haven't spent a lot of time thinking about what happened in the past and recognizing that these aren't things that will quickly recover once we get through this period. So stabilizing things will not mean it goes back to normal. We actually have to put a lot of effort into really bending that curve. And then really just to emphasize, you know, at the end, right? Again, the dinosaurs were in their prime when this happened. They were going strong. They were doing really crazy new things that they were proud of as a clade. Crocodiles, they're doing great right now from an evolutionary perspective. They're doing a lot of new things, maybe more in some ways than they have done before. But that's not going to stop this from happening, and that's not going to stop them from going extinct if we keep treating the planet the way that we are. And so I just want to leave you then with this final thought here from Darwin himself, that the love for all living creatures is the most noble attribute of man. Because I think if all of us really are rationally approaching what we understand about the natural world and what we are doing to the planet right now, then we will all be driven to change our behaviors and make sure that we are actually living up to this. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, Anjali, that was absolutely amazing. That was a complete tour de force. Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. And I can't remember if I've told you this before, but when I was doing my medical degree, I took a little break in the middle of it to do an anatomy degree. And I did this little research project looking at embryo skulls and how they developed. And drawing around, I was in a dark room with a projection microscope, drawing around the outside of the chondrocranium, the cartilage base of the skull, and creating these enormous models, which I then coloured with tissue paper, and I think they thought I was quite mad. And at that point in time, I think if I'd heard you give this lecture tonight, I would have been like, that is what I want to do. And I could have gone off in a completely different direction. It's absolutely wonderful to see the joy that you bring to this subject. Your passion for it shines through. The way that you can open this up to a broad audience is absolutely fantastic. And I have got loads of questions, but I expect you have as well. So I'd like to start with some questions from our audience. I'm going to hold back. Family hold back, isn't it? There's somebody right at the back there with their hand up. So you may have the first question. We've got roving microphones, so wait for the roving microphone to come along to you. I've tweeted about the cats, so I'm expecting that will kick that whole thing off on Twitter again.
It always does.
So, first question, please.
Hi there. Is there a particular species or species group whose evolution really excites you, and why?
Well, apart from cats.
Apart from cats.
Apart from cats.
Apart from cats. I'll probably list off 100 different groups right now. Okay, so one part of this project that we've been doing in my lab over the last 8 years or so across vertebrates in general really taught me that amphibians are arguably the greatest vertebrates. They are really, really weird. They vary in ways that mammals and birds don't do, right? So in terms of how they develop, metamorphosis, direct development, all kinds of different ways. And actually, they can even vary within individual species, depending on their environment, which is completely crazy to me. So, one individual on one island might be a direct developer, so they just give birth to essentially something that doesn't have to go through metamorphosis. On other islands, they do, depending on the local environments. So that's really crazy to me. And also, we found that in some groups, really habitat drives what they do or how they evolve. So that's, for example, in frogs. But actually, in other groups like salamanders, it's all about how they develop. So whether or not they go through metamorphosis or not is a huge impact on how they evolve. But actually, even in frogs, metamorphosis has this lingering effect that if they do go through metamorphosis, well, they all go through metamorphosis, but if they're young, actually have to do a lot of stuff by themselves, then they don't evolve as fast in general, which is a really interesting thing that is kind of counter a lot of hypotheses about why metamorphosis is so common. Like half of animals on the planet go through metamorphosis. So that's a really interesting group. But of all the amphibians, my favorite group are the Caecilians, which I don't know if any of you have heard of Caecilians. They look like worms. People think they're snakes. They're actually amphibians. And on the outside, they all look kind of the same, to be honest. They just look like kind of weird worm snakes with these very teethy mouths. But actually, once you take their skin off, sorry, I always say this, but their skulls are incredibly diverse. They don't look at all the same on the inside, and it's just and there's never very many of them. There's 30 or so different genera, maybe 60 species. But I feel like every single one of them is as different as a mammal and a bird are to each other. So that's a really crazy group. That's one of my favorites at the moment.
Oh, I need to I need to find out more about Sicilians now. I want to ask you a very quick question before I let somebody else ask another question, which is about your kind of fascination with skulls and with the phenotype, with how animals appear on the inside and the outside. Is the skull, is the variation in the skull a good kind of correlate for genetic diversity?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question, actually, as opposed to like any other part of the anatomy, or just in general.
Yeah, both actually.
Okay. I think it's a better correlate of diversity than other parts of the skeleton in general, because the other parts of the skeleton are generally kind of one function, whereas the skull has a variety of different functions, which means that you'll get some signal from sexual display, you'll get some signal from dietary diversity, you'll get some signal from sensory diversity and eyesight and all those things. You'll get some signal from brain size, you'll get some signal from fighting behavior and prey capture and all these things. Whereas with the other stuff, I mean, there's definitely important signal in other parts of the skeleton, and we've measured it at various points in different groups, but not nearly as much. So I would guess that actually you see more of that kind of similarity in terms of diversity between genetic diversity and skull diversity. We haven't actually measured that yet. We do have a couple of projects trying to do that specifically. And then, sorry, what was the second part?
Well, that's really interesting in terms of, generally whether that's the case.
Yeah.
I think you've answered them both, actually, that, generally it is the case because the skull is very complex.
Yeah.
But I'd never heard anybody articulate it like that before, in that it's kind of representing many ways in which the organism is interacting with its environment. It's kind of summing that all together.
Oh, actually, there is the other aspect, which is the few times that we have tried to compare morphological or anatomical diversity or rates of evolution with morphological or molecular rates of evolution, they don't actually often match up. So we have some projects trying to figure this out right now. And so when you look at the early evolution of mammals, you find that molecular diversity predates morphological diversity. So you kind of get these groups, these populations that might be splitting up and becoming kind of reproductively isolated and acquiring kind of differences from each other genetically. But they haven't yet started to really diversify in terms of what they do. And that may well be because those populations were still kind of Cretaceous mass extinction. And so when you're living in the shadow of dinosaurs, there aren't a lot of options ecologically.
Yeah.
You're kind of all these little shrew-like insectivores because that's the only niche open to you. So it wasn't until, probably, we had the beginnings of the different major groups at that point, but it wasn't until, this is a really silly way of saying that, but it wasn't until the dinosaurs went extinct that they could really express their different personalities as clades, I guess.
And you get those niches being emptied out. So
Exactly.
suddenly there's room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
quickly, they fill those niches. Well, over the course of a couple million years. Again, quick. My standards of quick are probably different from your standards of quick. A couple million years is pretty quick.
I've got lots more questions, but I'm going to hold back for a few more questions from the audience. There's somebody desperately waving their hand back there, and I'm going to have a look up at the top as well. Really difficult with the bright lights, but let's go with this person in the stalls. Here comes the microphone.
Thank you very much for that. In the spirit of Twitter, 2 points. One, you forgot to mention that cats were worshipped as gods, which is probably why they haven't changed as much as anything else. And secondly, you were using a laser pointer on the screen at the time. Sorry. Is there any form or something similar, especially that wonderful Lovecraftian shark you showed us, that you think could re-evolve given similar conditions in the future? Or is there sort of a set direction or directions evolution will take?
That's a great question, isn't it?
Okay, so whether some of those forms could re-evolve in different groups. I think, so that shark in particular is a really early form, and I think that those groups, so a lot of times what you see at the beginning of the evolution of groups is this kind of crazy period of experimentation, and those things are where developmental pathways haven't quite gotten fixed into a couple of different paths essentially. And so that shark is kind of part of that period of shark evolution, essentially. And I think once that you kind of lose that diversity, you probably can't necessarily re-evolve some of those unless something else happens to really, empty out space and kind of reset those kind of pathways. But I mean, I say that, but on the other hand, we do see, with other groups potentially evolving stuff similarly. So maybe you might see something like that form evolving in another group. I mean, there's certainly other groups of fishes that do lots of crazy things with where they have, things like teeth and denticles and stuff like that. So possibly, I mean, I think more and more we're understanding that the genes that give rise to some of these crazy, or that actually underlie some of these really crazy anatomical units are kind of co-opted or stolen from other parts of the genome, and maybe they can be kind of supporting re-evolution of those traits. I think it's fairly unlikely for some of those really crazy things like that kind of show up really early in a clade's evolution. But if there's something that shows up in a kind of a more mature lineage, I suppose, then I think it's possible. Like, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if saber-tooth re-evolved again, because it's evolved over and over and over again, actually, in many different groups at this point. So it seems like that's a fairly easy thing to evolve. But if it's something that's really kind of breaking or following a completely different developmental path, yeah, it's probably less likely.
I suppose it depends how early on in development particular
exactly.
genes are being switched on as well.
Yeah.
I imagine that the genes that are being switched on very early, like the Hox patterning genes, which kind of lay down the segments of the body, if you start mucking around with those, that's going to have kind of sequelae in all sorts of different organ systems, and it's just not going to work.
Yeah, it won't be viable. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is, like, how do systems balance? I mean, obviously, there's variation is the basis of evolution, right? You have to have variation within populations for natural selection to act on. So obviously, variation is generated through our normal genetic and developmental processes. But you have to have enough constraint on that, or enough stability, so that you generate, viable offspring. And so where that balance actually is, and kind of what the relationship is between variation and error, is something that I'm really interested in. But it's not, I think, not very well explored yet.
Yeah. I mean, there's ideas about redundancy in the system, about how much variation you can have, because development is such a complex process, embryological development. When you consider that each of us has developed from a single cell, I mean, it is still mind blowing. I teach embryology at Birmingham University, and I still just find it utterly mind blowing. I think it also helps people overcome that kind of leap of understanding about evolution as well. I've talked to people who are nervous about that insight of evolution, Darwin's insight that everything comes from this common origin, and the nervousness about knowing that you're related to all the single-celled things which are living all over us. But the fact that we've all come from single cells ourselves in our own lifetimes helps to kind of make it more acceptable.
And also how similar we look at early stages in development.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There's another question down here in the front from my... Do we have questions online? Who's got those? Because I don't have those. You've got them.
Thank you very much for a great talk. I just wondered whether you're concerned at all about humans now starting to release genetically modified organisms, usually using various gene editing techniques to improve farming and agriculture, particularly plants and to some extent animals. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Thank you very much for that question. For those of you who you probably recognise the voice, it's lovely to have Professor Robert Winston with us tonight. Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it is something that needs to be very carefully controlled. I think there's a lot of worry about modified organisms essentially making it impossible for any wild organisms to continue. Essentially, if they outcompete them in the wild, then you completely lose any natural variance. And this is obviously a huge problem with agriculture. So I think that's a worry. On the animal side, I think obviously there are, in general, more controls on that end. But I think it's difficult to an extent because, obviously, we need to feed people. And it's very difficult to argue against technologies that can improve kind of crop yields and things like that. But I do also really worry that we're making it impossible for anything wild to persist. And so we know this, right, when we look at just percentages of land area or percentage of biomass that are actual wilderness at this point, or wild animals, like just looking at mammals, right? Less than 5% of mammal biomass right now is a wild animal. It's either humans or it's domesticated animals. And so if you take that 5% and all of a sudden, modified species are then also either interbreeding or outcompeting in all of their natural areas, then we will have nothing wild and natural left. So I do think it's a worry. I think it's a tricky one because of having to balance, obviously, supporting a human population and supporting everybody to live decent lives is an important worry and an important concern. So I think balancing those things is important. I think the thing that I maybe have more clear-cut feelings about are things like de-extinction, and when people suggest using modifications of genomes or bringing genomes back from the past to rewild areas that are either already long gone, just because it's a fun pursuit, as opposed to doing things that can actually make things better for the species that are still around today.
Yeah.
That, I think, is really quite a diversion and really a waste of resources, and also probably quite dangerous. But I think the other aspects are certainly a worry, but a difficult thing to balance. And I would just like to make sure that there's good control so that we don't have those genomes really kind of invading all the wild areas. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really interesting ethical questions, and especially coming from Robert, who is an IVF specialist and understands very well the ramifications of modifying genes. We have these incredibly precise ways now of interacting with the genome and cutting out pieces of DNA using basically bacterial devices. You might have heard of CRISPR-Cas9. That kind of, I suppose it accelerates what we've always done with domesticating animals and plants. So I'm not sure I see it as something completely different to what we've done before, where we've altered animals and plants genetically by breeding. It does seem to be, there is something different in that we're introducing the novelty into the genome, and I don't think we've done that before. I think we've selected from the novelty that's already there. Although, having said that, I wrote a book about domestication a few years ago, and I was amazed to learn, and maybe I was just very naive, but I was amazed to learn that many of our crops that we don't think are GM, are GM. And they are developed through something called radiation breeding, where you zap plants with radiation to create random mutations, and then you select from that group of variants ones that have desirable traits, which have obviously got new mutations in their genome that you've created by radiation. By the time they get out into the fields, you're talking about the descendants of those. So it's not as though the crops in our fields are irradiated, but their ancestors were. And we've introduced novelty into their genomes. And I'm really interested in law that is considered to be quite separate from this biological means of altering the genome. And that seems to me to be a scientific fiddle, and something which is really important to get our heads around ethically. And I actually think that Humanists UK is a really good vehicle for exploring these types of questions. And maybe these are kind of ethical questions that we start to think, yes, it would be great to have a panel event at what is still called the convention, but I think they should call it the festival in the summer. Looking at these edges of science and looking at the ethics and as a society how we should be managing that, right, as well as the collapse in biodiversity.
Yeah.
And and the fact that we know that we absolutely know that our domesticated species exchange genes with wild species. There's no barrier between domesticated species and the rest of the natural world. So that we know that apple trees have interbred with crab apples all the way through from when they were first domesticated in the orchards of Kazakhstan 10,000 years ago, or whenever it was. And so that there is that nervousness about, if we have modified genes, about those getting out into wild species. And that is completely correct. They will get out into wild species, and we don't know how that's going to affect those species in the future.
And these decisions and these conversations are usually kind of responsive, as opposed to thinking about, okay, we know that these technologies are developing, let's get ahead of it, and have that discussion and set a policy so we can have that conversation before it's too late, quite frankly, before they're all out and loose.
And we did hear, didn't we, about, I mean, I don't know what happened to that story about the babies in China that apparently were modified. Robert, I don't know if you've heard any more about that, because there was a story that a geneticist had done this, had genetically modified humans. Right, okay. Yeah, it's disappeared, isn't it? Yeah. 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 What do you think about it? What do you think about gene editing in humans? Yeah, yeah.
I think genetic disease, there are much better ways of dealing with. But I think what I think concerned me about plants particularly is as Professor Goswami, as you were saying, the issue of microorganisms and insects and other small animals in the environment, which actually we are in danger of losing and have a major consequence on the metabolism of many plants.
Thank you very much. Let's have some more questions. Just putting this out there, I would like to hear from some women as well.
She's had her hand up for a while.
Where? Yes. Can we have a microphone down here, second row? Thank you.
I had two questions. First of all, I was wondering why the dinosaurs went extinct from the meteor as opposed to any other species. I don't know if that's common knowledge for everyone else, but I have no idea. Second of all, I was wondering if there's been any barriers for you as a woman of color in this kind of profession, or if that's too personal a question, that's also fine.
Thank you very much.
So the first one was why did the dinosaurs go extinct as opposed to everything else? So, I mean, 2/3 of life on Earth went extinct. So it wasn't just the dinosaurs. It was a lot of stuff went extinct. And the dinosaurs are the ones that we focus on, but things like ammonites went extinct. Lots of really, really amazing lineages went extinct, actually. So, they just happen to be the poster child for the mass extinction. So in terms of why they went extinct, whereas other groups didn't, like birds and mammals, what people usually point to are things like being small-bodied helped, being endothermic, so generating your own heat helped, maybe having feathers helped, but of course, most dinosaurs probably had feathers, quite frankly. Crocodiles, so the ones that survived, I think it's still a little unclear how crocodiles managed to make it through, but maybe being aquatic or semi-aquatic helped to some level. So things that were, and some of those things are things that are common. So being small is always a good thing, going through an extinction. You just require less resource, you can hide. So those are common features. But it's incredibly hard to find the specific things that allowed some groups to survive and some groups to fail, because as I mentioned earlier, for every group that went extinct, or for every group that survived, we have examples of very similar things that also went extinct. And so that's why once you're starting to talk about 2/3 of species going extinct, it is almost random, quite frankly, at that point. What's amazing also is that's actually the latest mass extinction we've had, right? All the other ones are actually quite a lot worse. In 245 million years ago, just a little bit before all of my plots kind of started. And the reason that they kind of start around 200 and not much earlier is because there was something called the Great Death, or the Great Dying, depending on who you talk to. And this was the Permo-Triassic mass extinction, and 95% of life on Earth went extinct at that one. And it's amazing. What's interesting, what I love about that one, sorry, these are my favorite details of different extinctions, is that prior to that extinction, the group that mammals actually evolved from, these things called synapsids, so things like Dimetrodon, if you guys see this sailback thing that's in every dinosaur kit, it's not a dinosaur, unless it's Spinosaurus, which is, but mainly it's a Dimetrodon, which is actually an early synapsid, which is the group that mammals evolved from. They were actually the dominant vertebrates on land until the Permo-Triassic mass extinction. They get almost wiped out, obviously not entirely wiped out, because again, we wouldn't be here if they had. But most of them get wiped out, and the ones that are left are really a small part of the fauna at that point. And in that kind of empty ecospace region left over when our group took a hit is when the dinosaurs, first the crocodiles actually, but then the dinosaurs really explode and radiate and fill out. So really, sometimes when I think about the history of vertebrate life on Earth, or terrestrial vertebrates anyway, land vertebrates, it's kind of the synapsids, us being their current representatives, and the diapsids, or the archosaurs, which are the dinosaur group, really kind of leapfrogging each other, and one becomes dominant, then mass extinction, then the other one becomes dominant, then there's a mass extinction. And so if there's another mass extinction, and mammals take a big hit, well, maybe the birds will take over, because that would follow that same pattern.
So the dinosaur extinction, Chicxulub slamming into the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, that was like the revenge of the synapsids.
Yeah, exactly.
Not that they engineered it, I'm not suggesting that. They weren't that
180
clever.
million years, they are patient.
And the second question,
Right.
Anjali, was about how you've felt your identity has affected your career.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one also, because, I suppose to some extent I have to appreciate that my parents finally gave up trying to force me to go to medical school, because it wasn't going to happen. I really, I like to be outside, and until about my fourth year of my PhD, they kept bringing it up. So I think that's a big part of it. It actually was it was a really strange thing for an Indian person to say, who likes biology, pretty good at math. There are some obvious pathways, just like development, that you're supposed to follow. And if you veer off of one of those into a different area, all kinds of crazy things can happen. So on the one hand, I would say, just by being completely kind of off the wall, and fortunately having my parents be, fairly supportive of those decisions, my early part of my career was actually pretty nice in terms of being an undergraduate, getting really great research opportunities to work in whale evolution, going to do my PhD at the University of Chicago, and having a really good cohort and really good support from my supervisor, who took me all over the world on field trips. So that was really great. I would say that the time when, and I know not everybody has that experience, and I think I got really lucky, to be honest. But throughout all of that, it was always very clear that I was always the only person that looked like me in the room. It didn't really start to grate on me until later, though, until I started getting into permanent academic positions. And that was partially because, when I started university in the mid-90s, right, everybody was talking about diversity, and everyone's like, oh, we're doing all these programs, we have this policy, we have a diversity statement, and things are going to get better, just be patient. And then I was patient, and then a decade went by, and then 2 decades went by, right? And then I'm, a young academic, a young lecturer, and moving up the chain, and it's just not getting better. I'm still the only person in the room almost all the time. And that's when I started feeling really frustrated that there wasn't actually the desire to make change. And so I'll be honest, I have no patience for diversity statements or any of these things. They're just words. They're just words unless you're actually going to do anything about it. One of the things I've done at the Natural History Museum is start this program called the Explorers Program and hire a fantastic person who's really innovating to reach out into communities and get people interested in science. Because one of the things that really frustrates me is whatever people think about the reasons why you should have diversity, there are many, but the most pressing thing facing the world today is the biodiversity and the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, broadly. That is not a problem that's going to be solved by Europe or North America. That is a global problem. It needs global people to be involved. It needs everybody in all the communities to really buy in and do the tough things that we're all going to need to do. And if you're only talking to and only engaging with and only have leaders who are from small parts of the world, you're never going to get anywhere with this, right? And so unless people actually understand that diversity is a survival requirement at this point for humanity, I think people are not going to make those differences, those changes. And so that's not advice, that's a rant, sorry. Advice, one, you have to be robust, because And I always feel quite sad when I see people leave the field, and I understand why they do, because it does become a real bummer. The last time I gave a talk at Harvard, somebody asked me for a coffee when I was looking for my name tag, right? This is what everybody experiences all the time. So you have to be robust to those things. You have to be more robust than the other people that get to go through and be part of the group. Be your own advocate, because nobody else is going to be your own advocate. And try and find the people that will support you. They're out there. So find those people and create your own community. And then when you do make it, help other people. And make it so it's not as hard for them as it was for you. Because a lot of people treat this as though, it's your rite of passage. And people do this about women in science all the time too. Well, I did it, so you should be able to go through it. Or how about not? How about if we don't do that again? How about if we just make it better? So I think that would be my advice.
That's brilliant. And I think that's so important because it's interesting that I think that as there'd be a lot of humanists here in the room, there'd be a lot of people who have that kind of even if you don't call yourself a humanist, you're interested in rational thinking and in fairness and kindness in our society as well, and feel that there's a moral and ethical imperative to improve diversity in all walks of life. But as you're saying, it goes further than that. Yeah. It's not that there is a moral and an ethical imperative, but there's an economic and political imperative as well, and actually the two things go together. Are you optimistic though? You said you have seen a lack of change over decades. Do you think there is change starting to happen?
I think I haven't yet seen clear evidence that things are any different. There are more statements now being put out. Maybe in some cases there's more actions, but I haven't seen what I think I would need to see to be convinced. Until I see people of color in leadership positions, then I won't be convinced. Because it's really easy to, because maybe, everybody wants to talk about early career and students, and then the second they make that into that next step, then all the support dries up. And so until I start seeing people of color in real leadership positions, I will not shake anybody, or not, applaud any efforts, quite frankly. It's been too long.
It has been too long. We need to see it all the way to the top. We've probably got time for one more question.
Shall we do an online question?
Sorry?
Online question?
Yeah, let's do an online question, absolutely.
Okay. Maybe two that have come in that are quite similar to each other. So they're both asking about the sound mapping plots. And one person asked, have you done it for humans? What does it look like? What's the evolution rate like? And the other person asked, why are crocodiles evolving so fast now?
The crocodile thing is really about kind of Australasia and kind of evolving in that island region. They're actually kind of evolving the same shapes over and over again, but they just happen to be doing it in different groups. What was the first one? I didn't quite hear the first one.
What about human evolution? Can you apply similar techniques to looking at human evolution? Could you look at ape skulls?
Yeah,
hominin
absolutely.
Skulls? Yeah.
So we have hominids in our data set, and I think absolutely you can study them just like any other group. In terms of, I guess if you're talking about whether any of that applies to recent human evolution, I think the factors become far more complicated. And there's obviously a lot of interesting discussion about whether human evolution is still subject to the same forces as before or not, because obviously we have all kinds of different things that affect our kind of survivorship and things like that. But in terms of hominid evolution in general, we absolutely applied these approaches to human fossils and to hominids more broadly. I tend to slightly stay away from human evolution a bit, just because it's hard to get access to specimens, and people have people have even stronger opinions than they do about cats.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to draw this very gently to a close. I want to just flag up a couple of other Humanist UK events that are happening this year, as always. The Rosalind Franklin Lecture is back here on the 8th of March, and the Rosalind Franklin Lecture marks International Women's Day. We're welcoming best-selling author Sarah Bakewell to speak on how humanism has been a consistent force for enlightenment and progress for over 700 years, zeroing in on stories of women and men who've had an outsized impact through history. From her upcoming book, Humanly Possible. That's going to be a must-see lecture. So please do visit the website and Franklin 2023 to find out more. And then we do have the convention. Please can you just start calling it a festival, and then maybe the powers that be will listen. I mean, a humanist festival, so much. A convention just sounds odd to me. Anyway, it's taking place. I should take Adam Rutherford to task over this. Taking place in Liverpool this June, and it is a summer celebration of humanism. Sounds like a festival to me. Kicks off on the Friday evening with a fantastic top talent comedy gig, welcome drinks in the bar, and then there's a whole range of amazing speakers, scientists, campaigners, historians, artists, politicians and journalists. It's a really, really incredible weekend, and a chance to meet friends old and new as well. So do visit Humanist UK /convention 2023 to find out more, or just Google it and it will come up, won't it? I am going to end the evening now by thanking you all very much for coming. It is wonderful to see so many people here tonight, to listen to this incredible lecture, but also to support Humanist UK and the amazing charitable work it does, not only in our own country to try to be more progressive, to make this society into a fairer, tolerant, more kind society, but actually around the world as well, and dealing with lots of human rights issues in lots of countries. So thank you very much for coming this evening. Thank you very much to everybody who's organised this evening as well, because it always is organised exceptionally well, apart from the occasional issue of slides. I've never seen that before at a Humanist UK. It's not a normal thing. And well done, Anjali, for just keeping going. I mean, just barely broke your stride at all. And so finally, the very last thing I have to do this evening, which is such a lovely honour to do, is to confer the Darwin Day Medal on Professor Anjali Goswami for your work in enriching public understanding of evolution and the research you do as well. So it's my great delight to give you the 2023 Darwin Day Medal, and to thank you very much for your lecture. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.